text today is Joshua chapter 3, and we're talking about stepping into uncharted waters. That's a little bit what, although Van had preparation for this, his testimony was this is a new thing that God is doing. There's something much more new happening in Joshua chapter 3, though. And while you're turning there, you can just think about how unsettling it can be to leave something that's really familiar to you and step into something unfamiliar. I deal with students at the college level who at the end of 4 or 4.5 or maybe 5, depending on how many different majors they've went through in the time there, but they're standing looking at what's next. And even if they've known far in advance about where they're going or what they're going to do, it's interesting to see there's some anxiety about this new thing because they've become very familiar and comfortable in the thing they're presently doing. I think it happens in some sense for all of us if you're considering a new job or if you're preparing for retirement or you're starting over after a major life change, even something devastating like divorce or a failed business. You might be facing surgery or some financial challenge. For a church, that great unsettling thing can be for a pastor to resign and be in the search awaiting the calling of a new pastor. It's never easy to chart a new course, to make a new beginning. It always involves leaving the familiar behind for something unfamiliar. Sometimes the path is clear and it's obvious. And it's a lot easier then to take that path, but not always. Sometimes the path is not as clear. The terrain is a bit unclear. And you can have a lot of anxiety about what direction you should take. And even there might be obstacles that stand in the way. New beginnings almost always require at least some step of faith, if not a leap of faith. And you might be tempted when a challenge comes just to retreat to what is familiar and safe. Well, when we come to Joshua chapter 3, the Israelites are finally at this moment. This is the most important moment in the book of Joshua. Here is the chapters 3 and 4, where they actually cross the Jordan River. They will be, when we get on the other side of this chapter, they will actually be in the promised land. The thing that God had promised to Abraham will now have come into reality. Now, they won't have taken complete possession of it. The Canaanites will still live in the land, but at least they will be in this land that God had promised them. And so it begins in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, with the execution of God's plan. Here is the plan laid out for them. Joshua started early the next morning and left the acacia grove. Some of your translations might say Shittim. It might be helpful to make sure you know how to pronounce that location, Shittim, or you might just translate it acacia grove, with all the Israelites. They went as far as the Jordan and stayed there before crossing. After 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, when you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, your God, carried by the priests, you are to break camp and follow it. But keep a distance of about 1,000 yards, about a half a mile, between yourselves and the ark. Don't go near it so that you can see the way to go, for you haven't traveled this way before. And Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves because the Lord will do wonders among you tomorrow. And then he said to the priests, carry the Ark of the Covenant and go on ahead of the people. So they carried the Ark of the Covenant and went ahead of them. So Joshua leads the people from this area known for its acacia trees, Shittim, to the Jordan where they camped for 3 days. And Joshua and the officers lay out the plan. And central to the plan is the Ark of the Covenant. It's referred to in various ways here, but it's referred to 10 times in chapter 3, 7 times in chapter 4, 26 times in Joshua as a whole. The narrator just won't let it get out of our sight. So obviously it's important. When they begin to actually go to the Jordan River, when do they know when to go? I mean, you got about 3 million people here who are going to cross the Jordan. How do they know when to get up and move towards the Jordan? Well, it's when they see the priests get up and start carrying the ark. The ark will be their guide. That's how they know when to go, and it's going to go before them every step of the way. So it's probably important to make sure we understand what this Ark of the Covenant is. And it's just a box. It's a wooden box made of acacia wood overlaid with gold. It's about 45 inches by 27 inches by 27 inches. So it's not an enormous box. And what is contained within is vitally important as well. It helps us understand why it so represents the presence of God. We learn from the book of Exodus that once this box is made, God is telling Moses all the dimensions, exactly what it should be made of, how it should be overlaid with gold, how it's going to be used in the tabernacle. So as he's laying all this out, he tells him, put the testimony of witness in it. Now, it's not clear what that is when he tells him that in Exodus 25:16. Is it just the Ten Commandments? Is it the whole law? Is it the book of Exodus? What is it exactly? We learn later in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, that it's actually the tablets containing the Ten Commandments. So the actual tablets that God had given to Moses are going to be contained in the Ark of the Covenant. So that's part of how it so represents the presence of God. Now, in Exodus and Deuteronomy and even in Joshua, as far as we know, it would just be the Ten Commandments there. But when we look to the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 4, there, the writer of Hebrews is discussing the Old Testament sacrificial system. They're talking about the tabernacle, the author is. He's talking about the Ark of the Covenant. And in verse 4, he says, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, had the gold altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered with gold on all sides, in which was a gold jar containing the manna, Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. So it's actually in Hebrews that we get clarification that there are actually three items that are contained in the Ark of the Covenant. We have the Ten Commandments. We also have Aaron's staff. Now you might recognize Aaron's staff because that's the staff that turns into a serpent before Pharaoh. Now earlier it had been Moses' staff, but actually when they're before Pharaoh, it's Aaron's staff. It turns into a serpent. Pharaoh's magicians are able to mimic that, so their staffs turn into serpents, but Aaron's serpent devours all the others. Later, some of the Israelites are a bit jealous that Aaron is the chief priest and his sons are going to serve as the priests, and they challenge the priestly order. Moses has them take Aaron's staff and 11 other staffs, one from each of the other 11 tribes. They set them side by side, and only one of them develops buds and actually sprouts almonds. It's Aaron. And that is a confirmation that God has ordained Aaron as the chief priest, and his sons will serve after him as priests, and chief priest and priests. That's also in the Ark of the Covenant. And then finally, Hebrews mentions this gold jar of manna. We learn in Exodus chapter 16, verses 32 and 33, that Moses instructed Aaron to take 2 quarts of manna and to place it in the tabernacle to be preserved throughout your generations, so that they would know how God had taken care of them, had provided for them when they were in the wilderness. We learn now in Hebrews that it's actually a gold jar that contains these 2 quarts of manna, and that's in the Ark of the Covenant. So you take these 3 items together, it is representative of the presence of God. I guess we say it's a symbol of, but actually it is the presence of God. It symbolizes it, but in a sense it is. Now that's what we're dealing with. I would also want you to understand that each of the elements within the Ark of the Covenant point forward to the coming of Jesus. The Ten Commandments, who will fulfill the moral law of God perfectly? Not Moses, not Aaron, not Joshua. It will be 1,400 years later, after the book of Joshua is written, before someone shows up who can perfectly fulfill the moral law of God. Aaron's rod represents his priestly duties, his priestly leadership over the people. Who will be the ultimate and final chief priest, who will make sacrifice for the sins of human beings and then sit down at the right hand of God. One sacrifice for all time, for all people. It won't be Aaron. It won't be Aaron's sons. It will be Jesus. And then the manna, that's the easy one. When Jesus multiplies bread to feed the multitude, the text says in John 6:35, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Listen to the way verses 32 and 33 describe Jesus and the manna. Jesus is the bread of God. Jesus says, which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. It's the picture of the manna. Jesus is the ultimate and perfect manna coming down from heaven. So the Ark of the Covenant represents the presence of God and looks forward to Jesus. So what's its role here in crossing the Jordan? Well, they're going to follow it. Now, they're going to follow it at a safe distance, but they're going to follow it. And why is it important that they follow it? It's because it represents the presence of God. If they just go marching out there to the Jordan, they're able to get through it without the ark leading them. They might start to think that somehow they are responsible for being able to cross the Jordan River. And if they get to the other side and they're able to uproot the 7 Canaanite nations that live there, maybe they'll start to think it's by their military power that they were able to take the land. But as it is going, they'll follow the ark at about a half-mile distance, and it's when the priest will get into the Jordan River that the water will stop and they will cross on dry ground, but they will only cross because the ark gets into the water first. The presence of God will lead them through the waters of the Jordan. And it will be the presence of God on the other side of the Jordan that will lead them to take possession of the land. It is the representation of God's presence. They will only be able to do this great thing by the presence of God. Now, why a distance? Why a half mile behind? Well, I think we probably already know that the presence of God is a little bit frightening. The presence of God should strike awe in us. We shouldn't take the presence of God lightly. It's clear they shouldn't take the ark lightly because it represents the presence of God. We shouldn't take the presence of God lightly when we come into this place for worship. When we gather together to worship God, when we do this on a regular basis, we should have a recognition that this is a serious matter. And to take the presence of God lightly or to treat it carelessly is a dangerous thing. You can see it in the Old Testament with this ark. You can see it first with just the presence of God. I talked about the 10 Commandments being in the ark. That's Exodus 20 when God gives the 10 Commandments. But in Exodus 19, when God says to Moses, I want you to come up on the mountain and I'm going to make this covenant with you. But he tells him, you're going to come up on the mountain, but no one else can even be within the boundaries of Mount Sinai. They've got to keep their distance because if they come too close, they will surely die. Now that's got to give Moses a little bit of fear. If everybody else would die if they came near the Mount Messiah, he's got to climb up on it into this fiery, smoky presence of God. We also learn that Nadab and Abihu in Numbers 10, those are sons of Aaron. They treat the presence of God carelessly. They go into the tabernacle. They go into that area where the Ark of the Covenant is. Or they're not actually supposed to go into the Holy of Holies, but they're supposed to go in right outside that into the holy place and offer burnt offering of incense. But somehow they offer strange fire, according to Numbers 10. Something they do is not in accordance with the way God has instructed it. They take the presence of God lightly, they treat it carelessly, and they die right there in the tabernacle. We also see an interesting passage in 1 Samuel chapter 4 when the Philistines are able to capture the Ark of the Covenant. Now, it's not exactly like this, and I don't see this happening very often, but when I was in high school, there was this thing where maybe a high school, if you would try to maybe steal your rival's, maybe their mascot or something like that, and it's like you'd achieve some triumph if you just had their mascot. This is kind of like that, only a lot more serious. The Ark of the Covenant, if Israel had a mascot, that was it. If Israel had a logo, the Ark of the Covenant would probably be on it. It was the presence of God among them. And the Philistines go to war against the Israelites, and they're able to take possession of the Ark. They take it to Ashdod, first city. And the people there start developing tumors and dying. And they say, this ark we've taken is too dangerous. It's too deadly. We're all going to die. You got to take it to another city. And so they do. They take it to the next Philistine city, and they develop tumors. And they say, get rid of that thing. We're going to die. They finally take it to Ekron. They start to develop tumors. They say, get rid of this thing. It's going to kill all of us. Finally, they say, take this back to Israel. The presence of God is not to be taken lightly. So the distance provides a safe distance. You don't want to touch it if you're not supposed to touch it, if you're not priestly, so keep your distance. But I don't think that's the major reason. It's true. But just the way the text describes it, it is in verse 6, carry the Ark of the Covenant and go ahead of the people. So they carried the Ark of the Covenant and they went ahead of them. Actually, go back to verse 4. Don't go near it so that you can see the way to go, for you haven't traveled this way before. Now you think about this number of people trying to find their way in an area they're not familiar. And don't think about a vast desert here with a river in the middle where anybody can find the water. There's vegetation here during the rainy season. You would have to navigate your way to get to the Jordan River and then through it. Well, how are they going to know? Well, they've got this little divine GPS. It's called the Ark of the Covenant. And wherever it goes, they're supposed to follow it, and that's how they're going to know the way. And at a distance, they can see more clearly where is cleared, and actually they can see from the heights above the Jordan where the water has been stopped. It makes sense, if they're going to follow it properly, to follow it from a bit of a distance so they can actually see what God is doing and where God is stopping the flow of the Jordan River. It will show them the path that they should take. And then we have the exaltation of God's servant beginning in verse 7. The Lord spoke to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that you will know that I will be with you just as I was with Moses. Command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the water, stand in the Jordan." Then Joshua told the Israelites, "Come closer and listen to the words of the Lord your God." He said, "You will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly dispossess before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Jebusites." The 7 nations of Canaan. When the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of the whole earth goes ahead of you into the Jordan, you will know that the Lord will dispossess these nations. Verse 12, "Now choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man for each tribe. And when the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of the whole earth, come to rest in the Jordan's water, its water will be cut off. The water flowing downstream will stand up in a mass." Verse 7, the Lord spoke to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that you will know that I will be with you just as I was with Moses." This is the beginning of the exaltation of God's servant Joshua. They are at this great moment, but I'm sure there's trepidation and fear. Crossing the Jordan at this time is going to be a dangerous proposition. It's the rainy season. The river's overflowing its banks. It's something like a basketball court length wide. something like probably 12 feet, but it's rushing. I'm talking about depth. But it's rushing water. It's overflowing its banks. And you've got 3 million people, including women and children, who are going to try to cross the river. This would be an obstacle for them to face. When's the last time they had a great obstacle to face without Moses? Even though Joshua started, Joshua won, we've had Moses' funeral. Now, Joshua, you're the leader. He promises, I will be with you. But they've not had any challenges yet. How are they going to face those challenges without Moses? They need to know that this man Joshua is God's choice for them. They need to know that God has called him and that he is competent to do this task. Otherwise, when challenges come, they're likely to retreat to that familiar and safer place. Joshua needs to know that he's the one God has chosen. He needs to have confidence in God's calling and in his competence. And the people need to feel that as well. If you're trying to lead people and you either don't have confidence that God has called you to do it, or they don't have confidence that God has called you to do it or that you're up to the task, then you're building on sand. It's most likely going to end disastrously. I mean, Joshua could have had more passion than anyone for entering into the land, for crossing the Jordan. He could have been a master communicator who knew how to convey that passion to others. But if God's not called him and equipped him to do it, the people are not going to have confidence that he can lead them. It's sort of just leadership 101. And in the face of all that, here is the Lord saying to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that you will know I will be with you just as I was with Moses. So you will know, this is to give him confidence, and it's going to be in the sight of all Israel, so they will know. And actually, by chapter 4, verse 14, on that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they revered him throughout his life as they had Moses. God's going to actually do what he said, and the people are going to revere him as they had revered Moses. They will trust his leadership, and it's because God is exalting him in the eyes of Israel. In conjunction with the promise of God exalting him, God instructs Joshua to command the priests. He says in verse 8, command the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the water, stand on its banks and step in. Now think about that. It's not that when you get to tell the priests to carry the ark, when they get to the banks of the Jordan, I will dry it up and they'll walk across on dry ground. No. It's carry the ark to the banks of the Jordan, and when you get there, even though it's overflowing, tell them to step into the water. Only then will God dam up the water and make a dry path for them to cross through. We're back to that. Every new beginning requires almost always at least a step of faith. In this instance, it's a leap of faith. You are leaping into a river with its banks overflowing. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this little phrase, but turn around, don't drown. Have you ever heard that? I can imagine the priest carrying that ark thinking, maybe we should turn around so that we don't drown. I mean, the National Weather Service, there's all kinds of data about this. More people drown. That's the greatest hazard for human beings in a thunderstorm is flash floods and people drowning. And about half the people who drown during some flood relates to people driving into water that is rushing out of control. And it doesn't have to be like an enormous river. The National Weather Service says 6 inches of water moving rapidly in a flood can be enough to cause an adult male to be swept away. 12 inches, a small car. 24 inches of water can move a car. This is like a basketball, where they're crossing is about the length of a basketball court, and the waters are overflowing its banks. I mean, all I can think of is turn around, don't drown. But God has told him to step into it, and then I'll stop the water. And then finally, the echo of God's Exodus miracle, verses 14 through 17. When the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. Now the Jordan overflows its banks throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the priests carrying the ark reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water at its edge, and the water flowing downstream stood still, rising up in a mass that extended as far as Adam, a city next to Zarethan. The water flowing downstream into the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed opposite Jericho. The priests carrying the Ark of the Lord's covenant stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing. Now let me read you another passage from Exodus chapter 15. It's actually part of a song that Moses and the Israelites sing after the Exodus. It's Exodus 15:8. The water heaped up at the blast of your nostrils. The currents stood firm like a dam. The watery depths congealed in the heart of the sea. The waters were dammed up. They stopped flowing like there was a dam. That's what had happened some 40 years earlier when God brought them through the Red Sea in the Exodus. Now let me help you a little bit with Exodus logic. This is Exodus Logic 101. If God brings several million people through the Red Sea on dry ground with Pharaoh's army chasing after them, they come through safely, and then God closes the waters of the Red Sea on Pharaoh's army and drowns them. And the Israelites march away free. You've got to believe if God can do that, then God will bring you into the promised land like He promised He would do. No matter how great the obstacles are there, no matter how skilled the fighting men, no matter how deep the Jordan River overflowing its banks, no matter what challenges would be there, Exodus logic would be, if God brought us through that, He can surely bring us into that land and dispossess those 7 Canaanite nations. But I got bad news. On the Israelites' transcripts of their Exodus Logic 101 class, they failed the class. Because when they got to the point of actually going into the promised land, 10 out of 12 spies says we can't do it, and the people said, well, then we can't do it. And now here we are again, with a whole generation of Israelites having died in the wilderness, and now we're back at the Jordan River. And will they pass the Exodus Logic 101 test? Good news. 40 years of a hard lesson learned, and they're willing to now pass the course. And they follow the ark through on dry ground, and now they've made their way into the promised land. I mean, if God can bring them up out of Egypt, and if God can bring them through the Jordan River and now bring them into the promised land, surely He can dispossess those 7 Canaanite nations. And in fact, He will. The priests showed faith and courage The Jordan wouldn't dry up until they put their feet into the water. What an act of faith. But that's the nature of faith. Being willing to step into where you can't maybe see the solid ground. Maybe being willing to step where the path is not clear. And yet you're willing to make that step, or perhaps in this case, leap. This looks back to the Exodus miracle. There's no way you can read about crossing the Jordan River and the way it's described about God damming it up and not think about crossing the Red Sea and how God dammed up those waters. This looks back. This is a continuation of the Exodus story, now going into the land where they should have gone 40 years earlier. It looks back. But it also looks forward. It looks forward about 1,400 years. When Joshua's namesake, Jesus, remember, his name in Hebrew is Joshua. He will enter into these same waters. Jesus will walk into the Jordan River in order to be baptized. It will mark the beginning of his public ministry. And what happens when he steps into those waters to be baptized by John the Baptist? The Spirit descends on him like a dove, and the voice from heaven speaks, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." You want to talk about exalting my servant before all Israel? A voice from heaven affirming, "This is my divine Son, in whom I'm well pleased." It's the same story over again, only now it's the new Joshua. And his ministry, his mission will be more than just taking someone into a land in the Middle East. Through his death and his resurrection, he will allow all of us to cross the Jordan River into our eternal rest. Now you know from hymnody, from hymns, that the Jordan River shows up a lot in Christian hymnology. In fact, hymnary.org has a website loaded with hymns. You can search words, terms. I put Jordan in this week. It spit out over 1,000 hymns that at least mention, have the term Jordan in them. It's come for us to symbolize passing from life, or from this life, which is temporal, into our eternal life. We do that because Jesus began his ministry in the waters of the Jordan, but ended them with another baptism, a baptism of death on the cross. And because of that, we can sing today with Samuel Stennett, "On Jordan's stormy banks." On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land where my possessions lie. When I was growing up in southeastern Kentucky, my home church was the Binghamtown Baptist Church. And the music minister there had been there for like 40 years. And he and the person who played the piano, his name was Dickie Seiler, regularly they sang a song together, a duet. The title of it was Sweet Beulah Land. I don't know if you've ever heard it. They sang it regularly. Even as I say these words, I can still remember them as a child singing this song and how excited people seem to get. Beulah land, I'm longing for you. Beulah meaning marriage, being married to the land. I didn't know then that's what that image was. I'm longing for you, and someday on thee I'll stand. There my home shall be eternal. Beulah land, sweet Beulah land. That's the chorus. The main verse, I'm looking now just across the river to where my faith shall end in sight. There's just a few more days to labor, then I will take my heavenly flight. Thanks be to God. Through the new Joshua, that's our song.